We begin this morning, though, in Ukraine with a sharp escalation in tensions between Russia and the West.
With more than 150,000 troops massed on the border with Ukraine, Russia's parliament has now given President Putin the green light to use his troops abroad. That's after Russia recognized two separatist-held territories in eastern Ukraine and ordered troops into those areas. The Kremlin now says it will support the rebels' territorial claims in that whole region beyond the borders of those two enclaves. In response, the United States and several other nations are imposing sanctions on Russia with the promise of more to come if the situation gets worse. The White House says a potential summit between Presidents Biden and Putin will no longer take place, while Secretary of State Antony Blinken has canceled a meeting with his Russian counterpart. Despite the breakdown in talks, President Putin said this morning that Moscow is ready for diplomatic solutions, but added that his country's interests are non-negotiable. Yesterday, President Biden lashed out at Russia's leader for what he described as the beginning of a Russian invasion.
Who in the Lord's name does Putin think gives him the right to declare new so-called countries on territory that belong to his neighbors? This is a flagrant violation of international law, and it demands a firm response from the international community.
We've got global security reporter Dan DeLuce and NBC News White House correspondent Carol Lee standing by with more on this. But before that, let's go to NBC News correspondent Aaron McLaughlin in Kyiv and NBC News reporter Matt Bodner in Moscow. Aaron, what's the situation like on the ground right now in eastern Ukraine?
Well, here in Kyiv, authorities have declared a state of emergency. Joe, this just happening just a short while ago. It is yet to be formally rubber stamped by the parliament, but that is expected for this evening. And essentially what that does is gives the state extraordinary powers to do things like secure critical infrastructure sites. Also, when it comes to transportation, they're now able to set up checkpoints in and around cities here in Ukraine. The police are now allowed to stop people and ask for their papers. And this is because I was speaking to the former Ukrainian defense minister. It's perceived to be a high threat level now for the whole of the country. They think that this country is at a higher risk for potential terror attacks, potential hybrid warfare tactics. So this is really a marked shift in tone of what we've been hearing in late from Ukrainian authorities. Just yesterday, we heard from the Ukrainian president in the morning say that he does not think there's going to be a wider war with Russia. And by the end of the day, he was calling up the reservists. So Ukraine is getting on a war footing, and all eyes continue to be on the Donbass region, where there has been violence in the overnight hours, killing at least one Ukrainian soldier and a civilian, that according to the Ukrainian military, Joe.
So, Matt, let's talk about what's happening in Russia. Moscow is now recognizing not just the separatist-controlled parts of eastern Ukraine, but that whole region, which is known as Donbass. Parts of that area are still under the control of the Ukrainian government. So is this the clearest sign yet that Putin is preparing for a full invasion?
Thank you, Joe. Well, it is certainly a clear sign that this is not necessarily stopping in the currently rebel-controlled areas. As you mentioned, President Putin has basically declared that the entire Donbass region is part of their territorial claim. And, you know, when he talks about looking for a diplomatic solution, we need to be very clear about what that means in his mind. That is basically the Ukrainian military now ceding control of the rest of Donbass as it is officially recognized on anyone's map at this point. There are other signs that even then Putin may still have bigger things in mind. You know, we all heard his speech on Monday where he kind of methodically undermines, in his view, any kind of Ukrainian claim to sovereignty or statehood. And we just saw this morning a really fascinating Russian state media report, complete with an infographic, that kind of showed you, it kind of visualized everything Putin laid out in his speech. Eastern, Western Ukraine, gifts from Lenin. Northern Ukraine, a gift from the Russian Tsars. And of course, Crimea, a gift from Soviet leader Khrushchev. So they are laying down the groundwork, if they need it, for further action beyond Donbass.
So, Aaron, in recent weeks, Ukraine's president has appeared at times to almost downplay the threat of a Russian invasion. Last night, he said Ukraine is facing a threat to its existence. He's calling up the country's reservists. The country has also urged its citizens to leave Russia. How dramatic is the new change of tone we're seeing in Kyiv?
Well, it is dramatic, Joe. I think up until President Putin's speech earlier in the week, in which, as Matt just outlined there, he essentially said that Ukraine is not a country. Up until that point, people here were taking these Western intelligence assessments seriously. They were listening. They didn't discount it outright, but there was a sense of disbelief that the Kremlin would go after Kyiv directly. But that, of course, all changed when they saw and heard for themselves what Russian President Vladimir Putin had to say. And so, as I said, we are now seeing this country assume more of a war footing in terms of the preparations that are underway in cities across Ukraine. Here in Kyiv, for example, they're scrambling at the moment to get satellite phones. They don't have them here, and they need them for some 500 critical infrastructure sites, according to an official that I have been talking to. So they're really trying to now scramble in a way to prepare for the worst.
And Matt, we've got Japan, Canada, and Australia now joining the U.S. and U.K. by imposing sanctions. I mean, how is the Kremlin responding to this global response quickly?
So basically, we heard it says it all last night that the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov, when asked if they watched Biden's announcements yesterday, said they just weren't watching it. They were busy. Russia, of course, expects sanctions. They have been preparing. They've been kind of building up, insulating their economy for years on this. They do not seem to fear sanctions. But of course, we are still waiting on harsher measures if Russia continues its push into Ukraine. But for now, they seem unfazed.
Aaron in Ukraine, Matt in Russia, thank you both. Appreciate it.
Now let's bring in NBC News White House correspondent Carol Lee in Washington. And Carol, let's start right there. I mean, Matt just said Russia expects sanctions. Let's start with the ones we know about so far from the White House. Who's being targeted? What's the latest there?
Well, Savannah, the White House has sanctioned 2 major Russian banks so they can't transact in U.S. dollars. And they've also sanctioned Russia's sovereign debt, which is seen as significant, although Russia has prepared for that in some ways and has a rainy day fund. And they've sanctioned individuals, so including some adult children of members of Vladimir Putin's inner circle. Now, the White House is underscoring that this is just the beginning, that if Putin escalates, the administration will also escalate in coordination with its allies. But they're saying that this is in response to actions that Vladimir Putin has taken so far. At the same time, they say that they don't expect privately, and the president said this publicly yesterday, he still thinks, despite these measures, there's going to be a massive attack on Ukraine.
And also, Carol, quickly, what's the latest word on prospects for a meeting between President Biden and President Putin, as was being discussed earlier this week?
Yeah. They're pretty dim. They're saying that this is not something that's going to happen. You saw the Secretary of State cancel his meeting with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, which was supposed to take place tomorrow. The Biden-Putin meeting was always in principle, meaning it was contingent on the Blinken-Lavrov meeting and also whether or not Russia decided to invade. The administration saying they've taken that step now, so that meeting is on ice.
And Carol, let's talk about some of the impacts here at home between the threat of war and these sanctions. I mean, the stock market has gone on a wild ride. Now Americans are already paying more at the pump. Gas prices were already at an 8-year high. They're spiking. Is the White House concerned about the impact of these sanctions at home?
Very concerned, Savannah, and you're going to hear more and more of them talking about this. They're having discussions inside the administration about how to address this. You see Democrats on Capitol Hill really worrying about this. There's been some effort to try to maybe temporarily roll back the gas tax. That is running into headwinds on Capitol Hill, but the administration is looking at all sorts of options. They're not saying at the moment what exactly those might be. But remember, the president is set to deliver a State of the Union in a week, and that is a huge audience. And so you can imagine that he would like to have something to say about this issue that's impacting so many Americans.
Absolutely. And quickly, Carol, before I let you go, I have to ask you about former President Trump. He's blasting President Biden's handling of the situation in Ukraine while praising Putin's justification for his move. First, let's take a listen.
I went in yesterday and there was a television screen, and I said, this is genius. Putin declares a big portion of Ukraine. Putin declares it as independent. Oh, that's wonderful. So Putin is now saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine. I said, how smart is that? And he's going to go in and be a peacekeeper. That's the strongest peace force I've ever seen. There were more army tanks than I've ever seen. They're going to keep peace all right.
So how is the Biden administration reacting to these comments?
Well, White House Press Secretary Jen Psaki was asked about these comments yesterday, and she said this administration is not going to take advice from anyone who praises Vladimir Putin. Savannah.
All right, Carol Lee, thank you so much.
U.S. troops are now on the move across Eastern Europe in response to Russia's latest moves. President Biden also announced yesterday American forces already stationed in Europe would be repositioned to Poland, and a new deployment of troops and aircraft are on their way to the Baltic countries of Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. The goal to strengthen our NATO allies there. NBC News global security reporter Dan DeLuce joins us with more on these troop movements throughout Europe. Dan, good morning. So President Biden laid out why he was ordering these deployments during his speech yesterday. Let's take a listen.
Let me be clear. These are totally defensive moves on our part. We have no intention of fighting Russia. We want to send an unmistakable message, though, that the United States, together with our allies, will defend every inch of NATO territory and abide by the commitments we made to NATO.
Dan, we know the troops are not going into Ukraine, but what's the goal of the president's moves here? And could this do anything to deter Russia from moving farther into Ukraine?
Yeah, this is really an attempt to, again, bolster the eastern flank of NATO and also to carry out really what the U.S. said it would do. And so this has been going on for several weeks now, where the U.S. has been sending relatively modest numbers of troops and equipment and aircraft to countries that border Russia in the NATO alliance. And it's to send a signal to Putin, really, that the more Russia takes aggressive actions, the more NATO will expand its presence in the East. And of course, Russia and Putin has complained that over the decades, NATO has expanded, that other countries joined NATO in Central and Eastern Europe. And this has frustrated him greatly. He believes that's unjust and that NATO should somehow retreat from those countries. And so the White House is making it clear to Russia, the more you take aggressive action, the more we're going to bolster that eastern flank. So they're sending these troops that are stationed in Italy. They're sending helicopters to those Baltic countries. But if it's not at all clear that this is going to deter Russia and Ukraine.
How important is this to NATO countries and really to Europe as a whole?
It's incredibly important to those countries in Central and Eastern Europe. Those Baltic countries, Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, they feel extremely vulnerable. They had very unpleasant history with Russia, Poland as well, and they very much were asking for this kind of reinforcement. And so that's what we've been seeing now for several weeks. This is the latest step in that reinforcement, shoring up the eastern flank. It's not much comfort, obviously, to the Ukrainian government. They're on their own in terms of fighting Russian forces.
And Dan, we know the Pentagon has told additional troops in Europe to stay on high alert for a potential deployment into the eastern part of the continent. Quickly, why has the White House not moved some of these forces into the region yet?
I think what you're seeing there is that there will be a NATO decision by all the NATO member states. These have been U.S. unilateral moves we've been talking about, but NATO as a whole will probably meet and deploy a NATO response force that would be all the members of NATO contributing to that force. I think if we see a wider invasion by Russia, more dramatic action there, then you would see a larger deployment of U.S. and other NATO troops all along that eastern border.
All right, Dan DeLuce, as always, thank you.
And to round out our coverage of this crisis this hour, let's get reaction from William Taylor. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine and vice president of Russia and Europe at the U.S. Institute of Peace. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us. Your perspective is so appreciated this morning. So first, to kick us off, I want to first play what Secretary Blinken had to say about Vladimir Putin at his press conference with Ukraine's foreign minister yesterday. Let's listen.
His plan all along has been to invade Ukraine, to control Ukraine and its people, to destroy Ukraine's democracy, which offers a stark contrast to the autocracy that he leads, to reclaim Ukraine as a part of Russia. That's why this is the greatest threat to security in Europe since World War II. Ukraine is in danger.
The greatest threat to security in Europe since World War II. Do you agree with that assessment by Blinken? And what do you make of the situation right now? Did you expect it to escalate as we've seen it thus far?
Savannah, I do agree that this is the greatest threat since World War II. It's clearly the biggest buildup of weapons and arms by the Russians since World War II. It has the potential to be as damaging as the big battles in World War II that claimed many, many casualties, deaths of soldiers as well as civilians. So this is a major challenge. This is something we have to take very seriously. And we've seen the Russians move into Ukraine. The Russians have gone across an internationally recognized border into Ukraine, into a sovereign country, their neighbor. And Secretary Blinken's right. This is what President Putin has had in mind all the time. He wants to control Ukraine. He wants to dominate Ukraine. The Ukrainians, it's a sovereign country. They want to live a normal life. They would like to be part of Europe. And so that's a challenge that we have to support, and that Secretary Blinken is doing exactly that.
And let's talk about the sanctions that have been handed down so far by the U.S. and others as they have crossed this border. Some people are calling for tougher measures right away, but the Biden administration seems to prefer holding some options back, essentially saying that full-scale punishment right now means there isn't this leverage for a full-scale invasion later. Do you agree with that strategy? What do you think should be done at this point? Because, as you mentioned, they have crossed that border.
They've crossed that border. They've moved into a territory that they've controlled for 8 years. So that means they haven't actually confronted in a military way. They haven't been fighting. The Russians have gone into an area that is not contested, that they have gone in without a battle. The next step would cause the big battle that we're concerned about. And while we want to punish. We want to demonstrate that we can push back on this aggression, this invasion that has already happened. We also want to demonstrate that we can do a lot worse. He has gone in there, but he can do a lot worse, and then we can do even worse than that.
Before I let you go, I do want to ask you about that meeting that was on the table, has since been called off, between President Biden and President Putin. And Secretary Blinken canceled this meeting with his Russian counterpart. I mean, diplomatic efforts seem to have thawed. Have we reached the point of no return here, or is there still a path to avoiding war?
It's up to the Russians, Savannah. It's up to the Russians. They have demonstrated so far that they're not serious about any kind of a negotiation or a way to, like civilized nations do, sit down around a table and address concerns. They've not shown any indication. They're not serious. Therefore, it's up to them. I think Secretary Blinken has indicated he's willing to get together with his counterpart, Lavrov. But so far, there's no indication that Lavrov is serious.
Former Ambassador William Taylor, thank you so much. Again, your perspective is appreciated this morning.
Thank you.
Jury deliberations will get underway this morning for 3 former Minneapolis police officers charged with violating George Floyd's civil rights. Closing arguments wrapped up yesterday in the federal trial for the officers who were on the scene when Floyd died. NBC News correspondent Megan Fitzgerald has the latest on the case.
Jurors listened to testimony from more than 30 witnesses called by the defense and the prosecution, but now this trial is coming to an end.
The fate of 3 former Minneapolis police officers will soon be in the hands of a jury after both sides delivered closing arguments in the federal civil rights case. The prosecution making the case that these officers knew George Floyd needed medical help and didn't act, arguing that defendant Tu Tao stood for 6 minutes and stared at Officer Chauvin and George Floyd, and J. Alexander King was afraid to speak up to Chauvin despite checking Floyd's pulse twice and not finding one. Thomas Lane was holding down Floyd's legs, choosing not to stop the horror unfolding right under his nose. Legal experts say the prosecution has to prove willfulness, that the officers intended to break the law.
How difficult of a case is this for the prosecution?
This is a tough case for the prosecution because the government has to prove what was going on in the mind of these 3 defendants, that they knew that Officer Chauvin was acting illegally.
All 3 defense attorneys told jurors their clients didn't know Chauvin was committing a crime, and they deferred to Chauvin because he was the senior officer. Officer Lane testified that he did everything he could to help Floyd, even asking twice if they should roll him over. Lane said, "I remember Mr. Chauvin saying he is good like this when I said I was concerned." While Tao told jurors he was relying on the other 3 officers to care for Floyd's medical needs while he controlled the crowd. But it will be up to the jury to decide if the prosecution proved its case.
The jury will get instructions first thing Wednesday morning and then start deliberations. Back to you.
Megan Fitzgerald, thank you so much.
And now let's get a check on your Morning News Now weather.
Michelle Grossman is back with us this morning. Hey, Michelle.
Good morning, guys. And we are looking at the second punch of our 1-2 punch for this winter storm, the 2 winter storms. So let's show you radar because it kind of tells the whole picture, and then we'll get into specifics for this second storm. So you see the rain out in the Tennessee Valley. That's from our first storm. That is going to move off the coast today. In the middle, you see some sleet, some freezing rain, some lightning strikes, which is pretty cool, in parts of Texas, Oklahoma City. That's the piece of energy that's associated with that low that's spinning in the southwest. That is our second winter storm that we will be watching today through Friday. So as we go throughout time here, we're going to see winter weather alerts, and we have them in place already. 47 million impacted by a winter weather alert. Your pink is your winter storm warning, the white a winter weather advisory. And then we even have blue in New England. That's your winter storm watch. So look at that swath of ice. This is the biggest concern over the next few days, from central Texas all the way to the northeast. And we could see impassable roads in the bullseye in the middle of that ice, and also some power outages. Now, as far as snowfall totals, the highest amounts in the Rockies. And then as we scoot to the northeast, we're looking at interior northeast, also New England, where we could see 4 to 6 inches today, tomorrow, and then by Friday, even heavier snow. Boston, you could see a foot of snow. Back to you guys.
All right. Thank you, Michelle. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Michelle. See you in a bit.
Thanks for watching our YouTube channel. Follow today's top stories and breaking news by downloading the NBC News app.